Hello, and welcome to this portion of our conversation on single-case experimental designs. Here what we're going to do is draw a few different kinds of diagrams that give us an appreciation for the fact that very frequently the behavioral records that we might get, and you see a behavioral record right in front of you. We have behavior shown here on the ordinate or y-axis, changes over time. And the behavioral record, we're going to see that there can be a lot of difficulties in interpreting these behavioral records. Sometimes they're relatively straightforward, other times not so much. Why don't we start out with a relatively easy case where the behavioral record is quite obviously interpretable. And so what we'll do is, in green pen, we'll assume that we have some baseline of behavior occurring up until about the point of the intervention, and then the behavior all of a sudden thereafter begins to increase, and the intervention might have occurred right about here on the x-axis, and you can see that there's a fairly clear uptick. Now, what you might notice, if you use a laser pointer, that the behavior wasn't entirely steady. It wasn't a flat line, but more or less the behavior was hovering right around this mean area. On the other hand, once we get to the intervention, we get a relatively steep uptick, and this is a pretty easily interpreted behavioral record. So this would be an ideal case, especially if it's true that we want the behavior to increase. Sometimes when we're therapists, we want particular kinds of behaviors to increase. Other times we would want behaviors to decrease and go this way. But we'll assume here that we have a particular behavior that we want to increase, and the intervention seems to have been successful in this scenario, which I'll call scenario A. So we'll label this one as an A, and that's one possibility. This was relatively good news. Okay, so what we'll do then is we'll see if we can just turn this whole thing into an object, shrink it down, and we'll put this one up into the corner, and then we'll contrast it with some different kinds of possibilities. So let's go back to maybe a different color. Now we'll take scenario B, and I'll draw the y-axis and x-axis here on my pad. And then what we'll do is see that we don't always get the scenario that we might have liked. As we had seen in A, we'll call this scenario B, and we might see a very different kind of pattern here. Now, what might happen in this particular case is behavioral is really quite variable and sort of all over the place up to the point of the intervention. And then we see after the intervention maybe a more modest kind of increase. The intervention, again, is happening right about here on the y-axis, okay? So now we can take our laser pointer again and say, well, it looks like this person has a lot of ups and downs. They were occurring over relatively brief intervals, the ups and downs. After the onset of the intervention, we do see a bit of an uptick, but you can imagine that it wouldn't be implausible for this to just cycle down this way, at least in principle. You could have the behavior starting upward, but then going downward again. So here, B is a little bit less easy to interpret than was the case over in A, when we were up in this corner. So sometimes the uptick seems as if it's good news, but we can't always be sure. And the reason we can't is because the initial baseline had been so variable. Just to point to that baseline again, look at the variability that we're getting here in behavior. So B is a little bit more difficult to interpret than A was. So let's see if we can now click on B, shrink it down, and we'll move B up to another corner just so we can use it for future reference. So we have a relatively unambiguous case here of A. We have a much more ambiguous case of B, although maybe it's the case that in B we do have a pattern cooking here. But you can see that there's going to be room for argumentation. Okay, so why don't we go on to maybe a different color. We'll go to a red color this time, and we'll draw yet another possibility. Here's my y-axis, that's containing the behavior. Here's my x-axis. It's really the passage of time, and I'll draw time, well, I'll just leave it as baseline versus intervention. And now what will happen is we'll get a less variable case here in C, and this is scenario C, and we have a less variable case, but what's cool about it is there's a slight trend downward, okay? Maybe not entirely downward, occasionally it's bumpy, and then we get a pretty good indication that the behavior is going up thereafter. So let's take a look at this point on the x-axis, and we're getting, at the point of our intervention, a relatively stable turnaround, and we can do this by the laser pointer again. So this is pretty much downward and not too variable. There are a couple of back and forths on this, but you can see that we get a pretty good uptick. So this would be generally good news, kind of like A. Remember in A, it was really flat as a pancake and then it ticked upward. Here in C, in some ways, this is even more desirable because the baseline level of activity was actually falling off until we intervened, and then we seem to get an uptick thereafter. So that's all pretty good, and it looks like C then is a pretty reasonable interpretation. And we actually have an uptick after a downtick. So I'll put this one down in the corner over here. Okay, and we'll do one more. I'll go to a new color. This would be more of a black shade. And I'll draw my y-axis or ordinate, and then my abscissa or x-axis. And I'll do one more case that I think is maybe the most difficult case. This is case D. Okay, my D's sometimes look like O's, but I think you get the picture. It's D as in David. And what we'll do is we'll show that the behavior is declining, and we're going to hypothesize in this case, or just state for conversational purposes, that we have a downward trend. Let's pretend, too, that we do want a downward trend across this entire interval. So this would be good news. Here again was our intervention, right at this point in our x-axis. But what's difficult here is we don't know whether the decline that we see after our intervention is really fairly attributed to what we have going on here in our intervention, or if this downward trend was really just part of a longer downward trend that had predated our intervention. It's difficult to know. So what I hope you'll take away from this video is that behavioral records can be really important in these single case designs. We like to take advantage of them, but when you're trying to interpret a trend, sometimes it's not quite so obvious, and it certainly leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So with that, what we'll do is just shrink this one down, and we'll put it into its corner. So you can see that we have these 4 different possibilities in A, B, C, and D. And it also leaves us with a bit of a question mark, which is to say we don't always know how to interpret these single-case experimental designs. Sometimes things are clear, as we get in scenario A here, and to some extent scenario C here, but other times, as in B and D, the interpretation is much more cloudy. Okay, please make a note of what's been clear about this and what has been cloudy about this, and I look forward to taking your questions in class.